Okay, good morning, everybody. I'm Duncan Shermer. I am Head of Research Assessment Policy at Research England, and welcome to the second running of our webinar on initial decisions and issues for further consultation for the 2028 REF. I'm joined today by some colleagues from the other funding councils. We have Morag Campbell, Hazel McGraw, Hayley Moulding and Howell Edwards in the virtual room with us from SSC and HEFCU. And I also have a couple of colleagues from Research England, Miles Furr and Oliver Tardy, who will be helping to kind of manage the webinar and field some of the questions that I'm sure you have and will be raising during the webinar. I'm going to take you through a little bit of housekeeping to begin with, and a brief agenda of what we've got going, and then we'll get into some of the detail of the actual initial decisions, and there will be some opportunities where we'll pause for you to ask questions. Overall, the purpose of this webinar is to provide an overview of the initial decisions and including some of the rationale we have for reaching those decisions, and to offer you a chance to pose some questions to the FRAP team that will help you respond to the consultation. We've got an awful lot of people signed up for this, so unfortunately there isn't time or the kind of space to facilitate any group discussions. But as I said, we'll pause for questions at each time, and there will be sections to talk through staff and outputs through the various different sections of the exercise. And please do try to keep your questions to the relevant sections, and this will help us kind of manage the questions in a more kind of coherent way. Also, we have I believe, an upvote system on the questions. So if you do see a question that is someone else has written that is similar or the same as what you're going to ask, then please make use of the upvote system. This will help us greatly in managing the number of questions. If everybody asks a question, we won't have time to get through all of them. And in fact, I confidently predict that we will have more questions than we're able to answer in the time we have. So the more you can do to help us focus on those questions that are really important to you will really help us. So do try and make use of the upvote system if you are able to. We will also make the slides in the webinar available afterwards, and we'll put together some. We are putting together some frequently asked questions that we'll publish on the website. So if there are any questions that we don't get around to, then we will endeavour to cover them in the frequently asked questions document. So look out for that as we go forward. So the agenda, a little bit of an introduction. I'll go through some high level details on the REF and the FRAP programme, and then move into some of the more intricate details of the initial decisions themselves, talking you through each of the main aspects and pausing with questions during that. And I'll then hand over to Morag, who will talk us through some of the next steps and the ongoing timetable for the next few months. And we will then pause for any final questions at the end if there's time. Great. Okay, so moving on, as I said, a quick run through of REF and FRAP. I'm going to assume that there's a certain level of knowledge of this in the virtual room anyway, but as you're no doubt aware, REF is a significant policy instrument used for driving research excellence across the UK, not least of which because the exercise informs the allocation of around £2 billion of block grant funding each year across the funding bodies, and it provides accountability for this public investment. Therefore, development of the assessment between exercises is necessary to reflect the changing research landscape and to ensure that the exercise remains fit for purpose. So the funding bodies launched the FRAP programme, the Future Research Assessment Programme, to gather evidence and consult with the sector to inform the development of the next REF exercise. We published the key decisions on the high-level decisions for the next research assessment exercise and outlined some issues for further consultation. And there is currently a consultation live that this webinar is intended to help you respond to. It's worth saying that redesigning the UK's national research assessment exercise offers us an opportunity to reshape the incentives within the research system and to rethink what should be recognised and what should be rewarded. And this is a time of global shift towards a more responsible research assessment process and a more responsible research assessment system. And I think there's a greater understanding of the importance of research culture underpinning excellent research and wider socio-economic impacts. And therefore, these decisions that we've reached represent a shift towards a generally a broader, more holistic approach to research assessment. So I want to make the point here that the FRAP program has drawn on and generated a very strong evidence base for reaching the decisions on the next exercise. There's a number of evaluations that have been carried out, commissioned work and projects that have been done by third parties. This started with the real-time REF review, which was done during the submission phase, gathering intelligence and feedback from institutions as they were participating in the exercise from the front line or from the trenches, as it were. And has covered some other areas such as the deeper analysis of REF outputs, the use of AI and other technology in research assessment. We've looked and recently published a project looking at the costs and benefits of REF 2021 and comparing that to the REF 2014 exercise. Coming soon, we have an analysis of the impact case studies, which we'll be publishing, I believe, next month. We've sought expert advice, so we have put together an international advisory group, which gave us a view on both the international approach, the approach to research assessment in different countries, and also how the UK system is viewed externally. And we also have other work in harnessing the metric tide, looking at use of metrics and other data indicators to feed into research assessment. There are a number of pieces of evidence that are generated by the REF itself, the reports that come out of that exercise. So not least of which the main sub-panel overview reports, reports from the Equalities and Diversities panel, reports from the Interdisciplinary Research panel, reports from the institution level environment pilot panel, and more recently the analysis, the EDI analysis of the submissions put into the system, and also the REF director's report itself. All of these have been rich sources of evidence for our reaching our initial decisions. And then lastly, I think it's worth pointing out that throughout this whole process, we have had a principle of engaging and consulting with the sector, starting with some early roundtables on a number of different subjects, for example, early career research or broad representation of research outputs, or looking at impact, and then moving on to sort of more detailed consultations on the principles and design of the exercise. All of that said, FRAP hasn't existed in a vacuum, so we have generated and used our own evidence, but we also have been driven by activities which have and reports which have been generated within the sector as a whole. So not least of which the Research and Development People and Culture Strategy and the Independent Review Bureaucracy, which provided context for our decisions. So, you know, also the design of the next exercise is situated within an international move towards more responsible research assessment. So this is including the QARA program, which advocates for research assessment that recognizes diverse outputs and practices and activities, and that maximizes the quality of impact in research. So these are the drivers for change. So, you know, the reasons for wanting us to change the exercise. As I said, you know, I think there's a need between the exercises to examine them and make sure that the REF remains fit for purpose. But I think we're seeing at this stage that research culture and environment are crucial in supporting high quality research with impact, and they're key components of excellence. We recognise that REF can have a negative impact on individuals and their careers. It can hinder mobility across sectors, institutions and disciplines. And we feel that previous exercises have not recognised the contributions of those who weren't directly involved in conducting research, but enabling and supporting research instead. We feel the REF has contributed to a publish or perish culture, and reduce the diversity of outputs and research types. We feel that the costs have also increased versus the increased versus previous exercises. So we feel overall that there are some strong drivers for change, but we need the outputs, the outcomes of the exercise to remain robust, and we want a holistic solution across all the elements of REF. This has led us to a vision that the funding bodies have agreed, that what we are looking for is a research assessment exercise which should underpin a research system that produces high quality, rigorous research that's open to all, that it should be an inclusive and collaborative system that supports a diversity of people, institutions, ideas, methodologies, outputs, and activities, and that it should be an engaged and impactful system that connects research with wider society to bring about positive socio-economic change. Overall, then, we envision a move broadly, some high-level changes to the exercise, and in the next few slides we'll go through these in a little more detail. But I just thought it was helpful to gather a few bullet points saying what the macro-level changes are, just so that we can remind ourselves of the changes that we're proposing. So there'll be a move away from assessing individuals towards assessing institutions, disciplinary groups, and teams. As with previous exercises, we've moved away from using the REF as a way of looking at individuals, and I think that there's a further step away from that so-called partial decoupling to a more fully decoupled system where individuals are not necessarily the focus of the assessment. We are encouraging broader contributions to research and research processes, so being more inclusive of the people who are enabling research and being more inclusive of the types of output that we are accepting or encouraging in the exercise. And we're also going to place an appropriate focus on research culture and research environment, as we believe these are key conditions for producing excellent research. And as I've said, we're going to reduce the focus on research outputs as a sole means to demonstrate research excellence. So that's a quick run through of REF history and the FRAP program in itself, and a high level overview of what the macro level changes are for the coming exercise. I'm now going to go through these initial decisions in a little more detail, and we will pause in a few slides time for some questions. I can already see there's a few popping up on the Q&A, but I can't read them just yet. So we'll pause in a few slides for some questions. So beginning with the initial decisions, we'll go through each aspect of it and give you a chance to ask some questions. So the first part is around the staff and the overall timeframes of the exercise. So broadly, the next REF, the 2028 REF, will have the same time frame as the previous exercises. So it will conclude in 2028, will be led by expert peer review by disciplinary panels, and will retain roughly the same timescale as before. So we anticipate that the results will be public, that guidance on criteria setting will happen during 2024 to 2026. We anticipate that universities will make their submissions in 2027, with the assessment being conducted and the results published at the end of 2028. As I said, we will retain expert peer review by discipline-based panels, and I put up the unit of assessment structure there from the previous exercise. We're not proposing to change that unless there are any compelling reasons for changes to the panel structure from the sector as a whole, from subject bodies, or from representative bodies there. So moving on, as I've said, the REF will be conducted at the level of whole institutions and disciplinary groupings within institutions. This is the step away from the assessment of individuals. So broadly, the changes here, REF 2028 will have a new approach to determining research volume, moving fully away from any assessment of individuals. We intend to draw data directly from HESA records, so universities will not be required to submit a list of staff. Instead, the volume measure will be based on the average number of staff over the academic years 25-26 and 26-27. and we're proposing a pilot year in 24-25 to sort of allow institutions an opportunity to work through how this will work. We plan to retain the guidance on significant responsibility for research, and the field has remained in place in HESA for that purpose. But you will be required to give details on the REF UOA that staff members are allocated to. We'll be publishing some further details of these requirements later this year. Our hope here is that drawing data directly from HESA will remove the need for a staff submission and will therefore lighten the load on participating in the REF. Few points I want to make here just for clarity. So it's important to note that any of the changes outlined here in the initial decisions relate only to the REF. So decisions on funding outcomes based on the REF are a separate process and indeed a devolved process. So won't follow necessarily the volume measures that we're proposing in the initial decisions, and may actually be different across the different funding bodies as well. We also feel that fully breaking the link between individual staff members and submitted outputs will simplify the output submission process, so you're no longer required to attribute outputs to individual staff members with minimum and maximum numbers of outputs per staff member. And we hope this will simplify the output selection process and save some effort on the submissions. Removing these restrictions brings a lot of advantages alongside the reduced focus on submissions. It opens up more space for long-term research that might not yield immediate results, and enables greater mobility between sectors where the generation of research outputs may not be the norm. And it frees researchers to take time away to do other important contributions to their disciplines. It also removes the need for individual circumstances, staff circumstances. So you won't need to make a case for why staff members have fewer outputs than their minimum, and we hope that this will therefore streamline the process for unit circumstances, which we know staff circumstances was a significant effort during previous exercises. It is worth saying, however, that there are some potential unintended consequences. So removing the minimum and maximum levels of outputs required could lead to a skewed allocation of resources, where institutions may only support a small proportion of researchers, or leading HEI's institutions to buy in research stars. And we've also heard that it might have impact on recruitment in research enabling roles, which if there's expectations that they will be producing research outputs as well. What we will say at this stage is this has to be looked at in the context of the exercise as a whole. The people, culture and environment element, which we'll talk through shortly, will be assessing the vitality and sustainability of the research unit. And this may include some data on the distribution of outputs among authors alongside the narrative elements. At the same time, it's important that autonomous institutions are able to decide their approach to support research, and research driven by their own strategic priorities and considerations. So we hope this will give them space to do that. Great, I can see we're getting a few questions already. So I'm going to pause in just a second for some questions, but on this area, the questions specifically in the consultation are what the practical challenges are for HEIs and what the funding bodies can do to mitigate those challenges. What are the indicators for a substantive link for an output, linking it to the institution, if not through a staff member? Questions about whether whether outputs by teaching only staff should be made eligible, and whether outputs by PhD students should be made eligible. And a question around whether the proposals on co-authored outputs strike a balance between collaboration and focus, what impact we feel the sector feels these changes would have on individuals, especially those with protected characteristics, and what impact the changes would have on institutions. Right, so I'm going to pause there. I'm going to invite my funding body colleagues to switch on their cameras, and we'll ask Miles to look through some of the Q&A for us and let us know what are kind of the burning issues that you guys are raising.
Well, I mean, firstly, thanks to funding body colleagues who've been addressing some of the answers live, because that's actually been really helpful. One I think I need to revisit is, will the slides be shared? We might, yeah, why not? we will
Yeah.
post those on the FRAB website, and in due course they will be transferred over to the REF 2028 website when that goes live, I believe is the plan. Okay, and to make the most of the upvoting system, and also slightly to allow me to read some of the longer questions, which are making my eyes swim. Brevity is nice. One here, supported by quite a lot of people. Given that one of the aims is to enable, not hinder, mobility, can outputs published in one HEI be submitted by that HEI and then by the HEI the individual moves to? Oh, that's now disappeared off my screen. I'd forgotten it does this. Has anybody pressed answer live? Yes, I can. It disappeared off my screen. What happens if the output is accepted in one HEI but published when the author is moved to another?
So I think this is a question about sort of portability of outputs and whether staff can take outputs with them. So I mean, our position on this is that the output is no longer linked to a staff member; it's linked to an institution. So technically, the question is not whether the staff member is where the staff member is employed; it's whether the institution can demonstrate a substantive link. So we do need to decide how we determine the link to the institution. And it's possible, obviously, that staff and therefore outputs may have links to multiple institutions within the assessment period. So as part of the consultation, we're looking at appropriate indicators of a substantive link, and we are open and would welcome views on this.
Great, thank you. Won't changes such as the removal of the minimum maximum output submission of outputs won't changes such as removal of minimum maximum output, submission of outputs not only by category A staff, and 2 years of HESA data increase costs to HEIs? Use of 2 years HESA data for volume measure, increase costs to HEIs.
I mean, our position on the HESA data is that use of the HESA data, we hope, will actually be a benefit to institutions. So, you know, rather than having to produce a staff list and do that separately for REF, it's just a question of ensuring that your HESA are up to date. In terms of collecting 2 collections of the data, I think this is just so that we have a more holistic view of the staff volume within an institution over the course of the REF period. Taking a census on a particular date is always going to give you just a single point view, and you know, just having a number of data points I think gives us a more broader view on this. Sorry, what was the other side of it? So there was HESA data and.
Sorry, I've just pressed out. It's answered live, so I need to go and find it again. It changes screen. Won't changes such as removal minimum maximum submission of outputs not only by category A staff.
So I guess that the idea that you now have a broader pool of outputs to draw on, and that you know you don't necessarily have the same process of selecting outputs as before. Okay, I recognize that there was a process, I think, previously of once you know what staff members you have, you then ask them to, you know, put forward their outputs and select outputs from those outputs. And now there's because there's a wider pool to be selected from, that you know, there's now perhaps a more complex process of selecting those outputs. But I think the benefits of having that broader representation of research enabling staff and that opportunity, that option to have broader outputs outweighs the extra complexity that might imply.
Okay, thank you. There's a linked and quite popular question here. Is it fair to allow the submission of outputs by teaching only staff, whether institutions have no requirement to support their research, and for PhD students who are still undertaking research training and aren't independent researchers? Is that fair? I think is the fundamental question.
I think in some ways, I mean, just the second point, the PhD students is a matter for the consultation at the moment, so that's a matter for you to debate in your response. The issue about teaching only staff, again, probably is a matter for the institutions to decide within their codes of practice. It's arguably it would be a valuable output assessed by an output that's been assessed by the institution as valuable. So they have to justify to their staff why, if that's not the status the staff have, they are including it. In many cases, I would expect there to be sufficient research staff generated outputs that this wouldn't be an issue, but it probably, we recognize it is something you would need to address in your codes of practice.
Right, thank you, Morag. And this next one, again, I'm going through by the upvoting, and I suspect that this has been done to punish me because it's quite a long one. So I'm just going to read it verbatim. It was stated that this ref is to enable more people to be submitted and more output types. However, by removing minimum one, having no maximum, means that focus will be on giving more time to research stars to produce more outputs. This will be less likely to include early career researchers and other staff, with the added admin burden of assessing outputs created by staff not on contracts where research is expected, and the added pressure this may put on those staff so that HKEOs can tick a box to say that they're inclusive, which seems counterproductive. Would it not be better to talk about encouraging research at all levels within the environment? I think that's the fundamental question there in that context. If the outputs that are submitted are publicised with the results, as in previous refs, then individuals will be looking up this on publication. We'll be looking this up on publication, and so will future employees. This could be very damaging to anybody whose outputs are not included or submitted. So employers, I think, rather than employees.
Okay, I mean, so I think this comes down to the comments I had sort of earlier on, that we are hearing this from the sector, that there are potential downsides for the decoupling, for removing the minimum and maximum levels, and generally, you know, the kind of flexibility that we're trying to build into the exercise, that it's possible that an institution could put its entire focus on the research stars, that they could submit only their outputs and you know, use that as a way of playing out in the ref. What we haven't got onto yet, but we will do later, is that in the various different aspects of the exercise, the different areas of it, there will be narrative statements. So within the area of the exercise previously known as outputs is now called contribution to knowledge and understanding, recognizing that it's broader than just the research outputs, and there'll be a narrative element supporting the outputs that are submitted under each unit of assessment. There's also the people, culture and environment section, which I know we're going to want to have some time talking through as well, where there will be both an institution level and a disciplinary level statement. And we envision that part of those statements will be providing a rationale for you know, how the research outputs, how the research represented in the exercise represents the unit as a whole. So, you know, justifying why, you know, how it isn't just about one or two research stars, and therefore how their unit remains a sustainable enterprise, even if, you know, without relying on just one or two individuals. And also about the broader structures, the kind of culture and the background that supports other researchers as well. So, you know, not least of which early career researchers, but also those research enabling staff and, you know, other staff moving through the pipeline to become those research stars for the future. So I think that, yes, we recognise there are concerns here, but we feel that other aspects of the exercise are there to kind of mitigate that. But absolutely, we're inviting questions on whether this is you know, an appropriate way to strike the balance, and, you know, what should be the appropriate way to kind of weight the different aspects to recognise those important parts of the contribution.
Thank you. Very good answer to a very not very well communicated, but very good question. Not very well communicated by me, I think. I'm going by upvoting here. So how will the volume be calculated when the boundaries around some disciplines are complex and structures inside HGIs do not neatly reflect the UOA boundaries? Who decides how staff that don't clearly fit within one bound or another, how other staff are divided up across a unit as being relevant to which UOA, and provide the basis of the volume calculation? Or is this not how the volumes will be calculated this time? There is actually another question that's relevant to that as well. I will try and dig that out. It is one of them.
Basically, the unit of assessment is a tag that will be done by the institution. So the institutions will decide. Okay,
that's a very, very good and very quick answer to a potentially complex question. Is there not a risk of waiting as late as 25-26 and 26-27 to take a HESA average, which could lead to increased risk of researchers working on impact case studies that are then required, or a last-minute scramble to find case studies should the final volume calculation be lower or higher, respectively, than institutions, I would add here, anticipate?
The institutions will actually see the data earlier than we will. So they will be able to calculate their own volume reasonably accurately. I believe, Duncan, there's an intention to share the approach. Is that right? So
yeah, I think so. And I mean, partly this is one of the reasons for doing the pilot is to kind of take institutions over the jumps, as it were, and give them an opportunity to see how the HESA data will play out. I suppose there's a borderline case, isn't there, where you're kind of, small changes to your staff data tips you over the edge, and means that there's maybe one extra case study or one fewer case study required or not required. That has actually always been the case, because your institution had all staff returned at the previous exercise. It's just that this may well be sort of a little bit nearer the finish line. But as Morag says, I think you should have a very good idea how many case studies are required in each unit of assessment based on the kind of earlier run throughs of it. So I think that's our position on it.
Good answer. There's one of the questions that has been answered in text, but let's revisit this. Dr. Stephen Hill announced at an ALMA event yesterday a new consultation on the weighting of PCE in October. So, people, culture, environment in October 2023. Can you confirm whether or not this covers the rebalancing of elements, i.e. contribution to knowledge and understanding, reducing from 60% to 50%, and people, culture and environment increasing from 15 to 25%, or is it about the weighting of institutional / disciplinary statements within PCE?
Can I go? So the commission piece of work that I believe Stephen was referring to is on looking at indicators for people, culture and environment, having robust indicators that support the exercise. It's not explicitly looking at the overall weightings of the exercise, so wouldn't be exploring changes to the 25% weighting for people, culture, environment. But obviously, it is about developing indicators for the statements. So could be about weightings within those statements. The other thing that we will be doing as we move forwards is when the expert panels are recruited, we'll come on to all of this later, but when the expert panels are recruited, is we'll be working quite closely with them on the content of the narrative statements and the data requirements for them as well, and we'll look to understand what works well for the assessment from those purposes. But hopefully that clarifies where the room for manoeuvre is and where the room for manoeuvre isn't on this on the piece of commissioned work.
Right, thank you. I'm just going to ask one more question here, and then I think we're going to need to move on. Otherwise we won't get through everything. So nice short one. I like this. Will EDI analyses be expected to be performed on output data? Won't we have to attribute outputs to authors in order to be able to do this?
Yeah, this is I think that this is again one of the issues that we've had raised a number of times. That previously we have done some in-depth EDI analysis on staff submitted to the exercise. I mean, fundamentally, the question here is looking at outputs, and my position is that outputs don't have protected characteristics or any characteristics of any kind. So you can't do analysis on that basis, that the outputs are attributed to the institution, to the department, not to a staff member. So we can't do EDI analysis on the outputs themselves. So any EDI analysis would have to be done on the staff pool that are submitted through HESA.
Great, thank you. So I'd suggest if we move on to the next section now.
Okay.
I'll try and pick out any other questions in there that I think that we should carry forward. But as you noted before, Duncan, what we're going to do is to try and link questions to the section we're going through, rather than just have a huge mass. And we will address questions that we aren't able to answer during the webinar, mainly due to time pressures. We will address those in the updated FAQs, which will be published on the FRAP website.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, thanks, Miles. So yeah, I'll as Miles says, yes, I'll take you through the next section, and we'll pause for some more questions. As before, please use the upvote system. I think that helps us a lot get the kind of questions that you're really wanting us to focus on. So this next section talks broadly through some of the areas that we've touched on already, that the overall submission structure, and then we'll go through each of the initial each of the elements in a bit more detail, and pause for some questions, not on every single one of these elements, but to sort of give you some chance to sort of ask questions. So overall, this slide represents the submission structure for REF 2028. So universities will be required to make submissions in each unit of assessment where they have staff that contribute to the volume measure. So where they're identified in the HESA record and given the UOA tag that Morag mentioned earlier on. There may be some potential exceptions for small disciplinary areas, which I think we'll look to explore. We'll be looking at the submissions as a whole rather than three separate elements, and these will be tied together by disciplinary statements. So we've revised and rebalanced our definition of research excellence. One of the aims of FRAP has been to design an assessment system that encourages and strengthens the emphasis on delivering excellent research with impact. The exercise has to appropriately reward and recognise HEIs that create not just outputs, but create the conditions in which excellent research and impact can be produced. So therefore, we need an exercise which takes account of how HEIs support their staff, how they enable collaboration between institutions, and how they support broad development of disciplinary knowledge, not just generating publications, and how they ensure the integrity of their research. So this is, some of the things we were talking about previously about support for staff, whether you can say that you're, providing support for early career researchers and building for the future rather than just giving your, monetary support to research staff. We recognise that these are crucial components of research excellence, and research on research has demonstrated that positive research culture and underlying values and leadership are all essential in creating high-performing research institute units. So we've reshaped and renamed the 3 assessment elements. These are probably familiar to you now, a few sort of weeks out of the initial decisions publication. So previously, outputs, impact, and environment are now been broadened and increased in their scope to include a wider approach to research. And as noted by some of the questions, we've rebalanced some of the weightings to increase particularly the emphasis on research, culture, people, and environment. So we have, I'll talk you through all of these in a bit more detail, but basically people, culture, and environment is weighted at 25%. Which was previously 15% for environment. Contribution to knowledge and understanding, which is the element previously known as outputs, is now weighted at 50% rather than 60%. And engagement and impact, which is expanded from impact, remains at its 25% as with the previous exercise. So a little bit more detail on each of these areas. I'm going to start with people, culture, and environment, and I will pause after this section because I know there'll probably be some questions on this area. We intend to collect evidence to inform people, culture, and environment element at both the institution and the disciplinary level. There will be an institution level statement, which will be assessed by a separate panel. It will contribute between 20 to 50% of the people, culture, environment score for an institution. And it will include quantitative and qualitative evidence on the culture and environment within the institution. There will also be a disciplinary level statement, which will contribute between 50 and 80% of the score for an institution, and will also involve quantitative and qualitative evidence on culture, environment. It's worth saying that for all of these statements, there'll be data and evidence requirements to ensure the focus on demonstrable outcomes. This is what the piece of work that we talked about that Stephen Hill mentioned on indicators will cover, and I have a slide on that coming up to give you a bit more detail on it. Broadly, we intend to determine the content of these statements in consultation with the sector to identify the areas that are most meaningfully assessed, and we'll review the relationship between the institution level and discipline level statements, taking into account the kind of effort that goes into producing each of these. So that's the kind of overall look at people, culture, environment. I have a slide, as I said, on the work to develop the indicators. So we know that there's been some anxiety in the sector about this, and we want to make the point that overall we're looking for a more robust approach to assessing environment, or people, culture, and environment that is more sort of evidence-based. So we have a piece of work that we are commissioning, where we are launching procurement very shortly, looking to identify the key features of a healthy research culture and to identify the quantitative and qualitative indicators that can be used to demonstrate this. We anticipate that the work will consult widely with the sector and other stakeholders on the features and indicators of a healthy research culture, and we'll test indicators against some agreed sets of principles, and we'll produce a recommended list of indicators to inform panel discussions and the development of panel criteria. It's worth saying that indicators will have to be robust, they will be transparent, they will have to support equality, diversity, and inclusion. As far as possible, we will look for indicators that can be reused or repurposed, so data that are already collected by the sector. We're not looking to reinvent the wheel where we can avoid it. They should be outcomes focused, contextualized, they should be low burden, and there may well need to be differences in the use of the indicators where there are differences between institutions or between disciplines, and we recognize that as a possibility. Some potential indicators. So we've taken some of these from the environment statements from REF 2021. So none of these are new, but these are sort of some of the indications of what we think might be used. So for reproducibility, there may be papers published on reproducibility, or papers reproducing findings, or contributions to good reporting practices. On things like open access, we may have numbers or indicators of the percentage of outputs published which are open access, or the number of used open access data sets. For early career support, we might have details of networking opportunities or support groups, or funding for career transitions, or payouts of kind of limiting teaching workloads during certain stages of the career. And then on mobility, maybe we'd have data on the number of staff moving to and from other sectors, or the number of staff moving in from other sectors. The work will obviously have to take into account unintended consequences or incentives, i.e. the impact on research culture, or use of existing data if it's been repurposed for REF, and in particular the impact on those with protected characteristics. We are mindful that data can always have implications in those respects, but it must be robust and appropriate at the unit, institution and sector levels. And I mentioned obviously that we are mindful that there may be slight differences between disciplines in that area as well. So I'm going to pause there and invite some questions on people, culture and environment.
Thanks. This is going to be fun because obviously some of the more popular upvoted questions are the ones higher up the list, but I'm going to try and filter them to keep them more relevant to this section. There is one thing that's actually come up in a couple of separate questions around the inclusion of professional services staff, which I think is probably worth visiting at this point. One is, as more statements than anything, I think. As a professional service staff, I would be horrified if I was told I was now expected to contribute to the REF and had to work with professors to publish something within the next 3 years. It's not in my job description or what I signed up for. And given REF is trying to include professional services staff and technicians as authors, has there been any consultation with these groups to ask if that's something they actually want, or is REF creating more pressure on already busy people who applied to do one thing? So I don't know if anyone wants to comment on those at all, but I thought it was worth flagging them.
Sorry, Miles. I'm happy to speak about consultation with regard to so my experience of consultation with technicians and technical staff, particularly. Yes, there is consultation, there is discussion occurring with technical staff, particularly. That's been through the Higher Education Technical Summit, also kind of talk specifically with individual kind of manager groups, as someone mentioned, more broadly with professional services as well. Stephen spoke at ARMA. So there is that much broader kind of engagement, discussion, dialogue with technical staff and professional services staff as well. And also as part of that, the consultation is more broadly open to all research across people and individuals across the research sector as well. So that incorporates professional and technical services staff as well. But just to say that I think individually and across the different funding bodies, we are engaging with the diversity of different kind of groups of staff, not just traditionally academic staff, but also professional services and technical staff as well.
And here's another one that I think is quite timely, if not necessarily directly linked to this section. Questions. Can you confirm that the FAQ and the presentations will be available in good time, i.e. next week, before the consultation closes? I think it's a very relevant question. I think we have to answer that, don't we? Have to answer yes to that.
Yeah, we'll get them up as soon as we can.
Yeah, and thanks for flagging. Will there be a definition of engagement, and will the impact case studies be expected to demonstrate engagement and impact, or engagement or impact? Demonstrate engagement and impact, or engagement or impact? There you go. I can read that again if that's helpful.
I think it's all. It's the latter. I think we're trying to be more inclusive of engagement in the impact and engagement section. I think largely what we're looking for is in the the narrative statement accompanying the engagement and impact section. We're looking for an institution's approach to engagement and impact, and I think that's mostly where we're looking to capture that aspect of it.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead with this one anyway. Any change to the REF rules brings about cost to HEIs. Were the REF 2021 rules so unfit for purpose as to require such significant changes? This had a degree of support, so it was worth reading out. This point, if it wasn't, was a cost analysis done to consider whether there were in fact relative savings to be made by maintaining the status quo?
So I think I'd come back to the drivers for change at the very start. You know, I think that saying that because we're making changes doesn't imply that REF 2021 wasn't fit for purpose. I think that, you know, what we're saying here is that the you know, research, university research is a vibrant and changing culture, and I think that it's right and proper that we should look at the exercise and examine it during the period between exercises to ensure that it remains fit for purpose, So I think that it's a moot point to say that just because we're making changes, it doesn't imply that REF 2021 didn't do its job. And I think that, you know, the drivers for change slide that I had very early on, stating that there's this shift towards supporting a positive research culture, means that we are looking to make improvements to the exercise. Yes, we understand obviously that making any changes to the exercise does have a burden implied, but if we're looking to improve the exercise, then we think that it's worth the extra effort that has to go into it.
Okay. Who are you talking about in the disciplinary statements that you've mentioned? Is it people in the volume measure? Is it authors of outputs or self-identified groups, i.e. schools or departments by universities?
So is this in terms of where we're representing the research of that group?
Yes. Yeah.
So it is going to be broader than just what's in their volume measure, because there's a potential, as we've been discussing, to be more inclusive of staff members outside of the volume measure, so research enabling staff. But in terms of what I was stating, I think that, you know, writing a statement to say how you're being representative, it's about sort of showing that you're being supportive of your broader staff pool. So not necessarily just individuals who are producing outputs, but those who are kind of included in the volume measure and those who are on the career pathway to be producing outputs in future.
There's two things that are linked here. I'm going to read them both out. One is a statement. We've statement plus question. We have very little of the data you just mentioned, so would that need to be retrospectively collected or absent? The next question, actually, I think also touches on this. How will you account for lack of data and evidence collected for culture at the beginning of the cycle? Before today, the example we've been given of the universal metric so far is the gender pay gap. But we wouldn't be able to calculate that at UOA level until staff are assigned to a UOA. Plus, if the UOA is small, we'll never be able to do it at all. HR will never give us data that could identify individuals, which I think is a very fair point.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is why we are commissioning the work on looking at appropriate indicators to address these sorts of issues. And as I said in the kind of quick run through of the indicators and work that we're thinking of, there may well need to be some variations in what indicators are used based on institution type or on discipline. So, you know, I could imagine a situation where a small institution might have data that are missing, and there may need to be some flexibility built into the system. This is the sort of thing that we will look to gather in the commissioned work that we're launching soon.
Great, thank you. For the potential indicators for PCE, You didn't mention income. Does this suggest that research income will no longer be returned in this section? Will it be returned or evaluated?
I wouldn't. I think that I'm not going to say what is and isn't going to be included. That was just a quick list intended to give some ideas of what might be included. It is really for the commissioned work to determine what's appropriate and what isn't. So I'm not going to say what is or what definitely. I don't believe I've definitely said what's definitely in, and I also won't say what's definitely not in at this stage.
Okay, thank you. Is there a danger that the use of these indicators will encourage institutions to compete in this area rather than collaborate? It's also a complex area that will be reduced to a single score.
I can't envision this being reduced to a single score. I think there will be a number of indicators that we'll use. And I suppose, yes, that there is always the argument that once you identify an indicator, it then becomes a target. But I think we are looking to understand the impact of choosing these indicators as well within the work that we're commissioning. So understanding what the potential consequences could be. So we'll look to explore all of that when with the contractor when the work is commissioned.
Right. Okay. This is again, it's more of a statement, but I'm going to read it out anyway. Many HEIs won't have systems to capture some of the things you've mentioned under PCE metrics, e.g. teaching buyouts, an example given. This could create a lot of additional burden if we have to collect things manually. I mean, does anyone want to respond to that at all?
I mean, I guess the main answer is we have to see what comes out of the commissioned work. I would say that it's quantitative and qualitative evidence, so it need not necessarily be. I don't want to second guess what will come out of the project looking at these indicators, but just because there are no hard numbers on these things, it doesn't mean you can't sort of talk about a teaching buyout scheme that you have that supports staff at certain stages of their career.
Okay, thank you. Very popular question here. Which has just disappeared off my screen. Okay, I can't find the question I was just looking at. Oh, no, here we are. I think a bunch of questions just came in. Thank you, everybody, for the many questions. Could the funding bodies and/or REF team provide good examples of codes of practice with different options, rather than 150 plus institutions trying to draft their own, which is very resource intensive?
I think it's certainly something we could look at. I mean, every institution will have an approved, well, every institution that participated in the last REF will have an approved code of practice from then. It's also something that certainly I would expect within Scotland that the Scottish REF managers would be discussing amongst themselves anyway, without necessarily our intervention. I don't know if there are similar regional groupings elsewhere.
Okay, thank you, Morag. Looking at the time, I'm going to suggest we take one, maybe two more questions, and then consider moving on. When you say final report published for developing the PCE indicators with the draft PCE, does that mean that draft PCE, does that mean that we'll know the final indicators at that point, or will they come with the final GOS in early 2025? That's actually a very good question.
I mean, I guess the answer is, I suppose, that there will be a draft in the draft guidance on submissions, and then a final version in the final guidance on submissions. So you know, it goes the same as all of the you know, guidance work on the submissions. But yeah, I think, you know, I'm sorry, that's basically a bit of a circular answer, but that's the best I can say, really.
One of my favorite. I'm not sure how, okay, I'll do this anyway. I'm not sure how using the outputs of staff who are not paid for those outputs, anyone not on a research contract, can be justified in an activity that determines the allocation of QR funding. This is not the way to acknowledge the contributions of those staff and encourages exploitation who will benefit from institutions who will benefit financially and reputationally from IP that they are not paying for. I think that goes back to a point that was made earlier, and I think that you have addressed that already. You're welcome to, again, if you want to, or not.
No, I think, yeah, I think we've covered that.
Okay, and just one more. If we don't have a list of people that are submitted, how do you define the groups, the research groups that you talk about in the environment statements? Doesn't that bring people into this again when stating wider contribution beyond the HEI, etc.? Staff want to know which UOA they are being submitted in, so a large amount of re-education is needing to be done once the guidance is finalised. If we don't have a list of people who are submitted, how do you define the groups? I guess is
No, I think
fundamental question.
Yeah, I guess, you know, it begins with the UOA allocation in the HESA record. That's kind of the point of it. If it's in terms of defining the group for a discussion in the statement, then as I said, there's a broader kind of aspect to it in terms of those research enabling staff that you may wish to discuss as well.
Okay, thank you. I'd suggest that we move on, and that will allow time for more questions to come in. And
yeah, absolutely. I think we'll hopefully have a bit of time for a kind of mop-up session of questions right at the very end. If we keep moving, we should be able to do that. I have a sense that there's probably going to be some general questions that we're trying to, you know, we're trying to pick out the ones in the relevant sections, and there may well be some that are kind of don't fit into our neat little boxes. Okay, so moving on. So the contribution to knowledge and understanding element, this is the area that was previously known as outputs, and has been expanded to include the kind of broader contribution to the research, to the discipline. As before, assessment of this element will be largely based on research outputs, but also on an evidence-based statement at the disciplinary level. We will include research outputs as before at 2.5 times the volume measure. Co-authored outputs are permitted, and the output scores will contribute up to 90% of the contribution to knowledge and understanding score overall. We'll retain the criteria of originality, significance, and rigor. We will confirm the open access requirements as soon as we can. There will be a separate consultation on open access that will be launching soon, and we'll say a little bit more about that later on. And there will be codes of practice on the selection of outputs, which will largely be based on the existing codes of practice that all participating institutions will have had. We understand that it's not necessarily about reusing your code of practice in its entirety, but we do hope that there will be aspects or elements that can be retained in a future exercise. So there is an option to just use your existing code of practice, but hopefully you won't be starting from a blank sheet of paper. As I said, there'll also be a disciplinary level statement, which will contribute at least 10% of the score. This will cover the contribution of the unit to disciplinary advancement beyond merely the publication of journal articles and other research outputs. It'll look at collaboration and interdisciplinary work. It'll look at research integrity and reproducibility, and it'll look at the broader sort of open research practices, other than just open access publication, but open data and open science more generally. So this approach is intended to recognise contributions that enable research of others within the disciplinary community, outside of the submitting HEI, including production of data sets, software and translations. I think it's worth saying, I feel we're picking up some nervousness on the inclusion of research enabling staff as an issue, putting pressure on those staff, and that is something we're mindful of, and happy to sort of hear views of the sector in the consultation on that. However, we're seeing this as an opportunity rather than an obligation, and we feel that giving the opportunity for those staff members to have their research represented is a positive that outweighs the potential difficulties. But happy to hear from the sector in the consultation on that. On this statement, as indeed on all of the statements, we will work with the main and sub panels when they are recruited and established to define the framework and the content of the statement, and will ensure that the requirements are tailored differently for different disciplinary contexts, and that any data requirements, wherever possible, are based on existing data collections. I'm not going to pause on questions for this one, just in the interest of time. I'll move on to the engagement and impact section, and if there are any, we can hoover those questions up at the end. So on engagement and impact, again, as before, this is a rebranding of the impact aspect from the previous exercise. An assessment of this element will be largely based on impact case studies, but also on a disciplinary level statement. So this is quite similar to the approach we took in 2014, where we had case studies and an impact statement as well. The number of impact case studies will be determined by the volume measure. Overall, there's going to be a reduction in the number of impact case studies required. So, for example, there will be only one case study required while the volume is less than 10 FTE. The case studies will contribute between 50 to 80% of the engagement and impact score, and there will be a sliding scale depending on the number of case studies that are included. The criteria of reach and significance will be retained, and also a criterion of rigor will be applied. There will also be a disciplinary level statement which will contribute between 20 to 50% of the engagement and impact score. Again, it will be a sliding scale depending on the number of case studies that are being submitted. This statement will look to capture the contribution of the unit to impact that isn't reflected in the case studies, and also to capture engagement activities that underpin impact. We feel that overall the reduction in the number of case studies required will reduce the effort required, especially this will have an impact on smaller units or smaller institutions. And as with the other statement, as I said, we'll work with the main and sub panels to define the framework and the content of the statement, and we'll also discuss with them how to assess the new criterion of rigor. We've removed the minimum quality threshold of 2-star, and we hope that this will allow institutions to submit a wider range of impacts, recognizing that impact doesn't always arise from traditional outputs. But we will develop further guidance with the panels on how institutions will outline the underpinning research that ensures that impact is remaining rigorous. So the specific consultation questions in this area are around reducing the minimum number of case studies. What will be the impact of reducing the minimum number to 1? What will be the impact of revising the thresholds between the case study requirements? And to what extent do we support the weighting of the impact statement on a sliding scale? So this idea that the statement will contribute more or less depending on the number of case studies that are returned alongside it. So I'll pause there for questions. Invite my colleagues back.
Hi. I'm just going to ask, I think, what's one of my favourite questions that I've seen so far. Will REF assessment panels be made up of staff from across categories, research, teaching and professional support? It would seem appropriate if these staff contributions are being assessed.
It's not in the plans at the moment, but it's an interesting suggestion.
Right. Thank Thank you.
Yeah, I would agree. I think we will. We are currently sort of planning the recruitment of the panels, and I think that understanding sort of what are appropriate a mixture of people to represent this new assessment is an important part of that. I think not least of which is understanding that we have the expertise to look at and examine research culture as part of the assessment as well. So yeah, definitely.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. I don't know that you're going to thank me for this next question, but I'm going to ask it anyway because it does have some support. Metric Tide 2 report recommended changes over 2 ref cycles. Do you expect the rule you design now to change considerably to ref 2035-ish, or are you trying to do it all in one cycle? Sorry.
We're not proposing to do the 2-cycle approach as proposed by the Metric Tide review. I think it's very difficult to speculate on what will be required in 2035 if indeed we decide to go for a 2035 exercise. You know, I think that we've already discussed the need for changes in this exercise based on the 2021 exercise. I think sort of trying to say what the 2035 exercise will look like is incredibly speculative. That feels like a long way in the future right now.
Right. Okay. Thank you. I'll give you a really easy one now, and then go away and sit in the corner and think about what I did. What does the 2.5 times volume mean? Re-outputs.
Okay, so in terms of the volume measure, so there will be, as we said, staff will be collected through HESA, and we will look at the number of staff that are returned to a unit of assessment. We will multiply it by 2.5, and that's the number of outputs that will be expected to be returned in that unit of assessment.
Okay, thank you. Right, this one again is more of a statement, I guess, than, and now it's disappeared. Oh, that's lovely. Sorry about this. Some of the questions seem to be disappearing off my screen. In Ref 2021, impact case studies could only be supported by research generated while employed at the submitting institution. This meant that institutions with research generated from employment at other HEIs or other research institutions, e.g. central banks, could not submit this wider body of research in support of their case studies. Are there any thoughts about changing this rule for Ref 2028?
Sorry, could you say that again?
Okay, from the top. For Ref 2021, impact case studies could only be supported by research generated whilst being employed at the submitted institution. So institutions with research generated from previous employment, other HEIs or other research institutions, couldn't submit this wider body of research in support of their case studies. Are there any thoughts about changing this in Ref 2028?
I don't think so at the moment. The logic of saying we're trying to assess the institutions rather than the individuals would kind of reinforce the approach that's being described in the question for 2021.
Thank you. It's a good response. Okay, here's one. Relates. Is it the intention that impact case studies can be authored by colleagues on research enabling contracts?
I think, yeah, it's a similar answer to what Morag just said in terms of the principles and practice of the exercise of being more inclusive and of not saying an output is attributable to an individual. I think, you know, similar thoughts on cases. I don't think we've really nailed this down yet, but I think sort of in terms of underpinning research or in terms of who owns a case study, it would be more about being linked to the unit or the institution rather than to an individual. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it could be interesting to see if anything comes in relevant relating to this through the consultation proper itself. Be interesting to look at that. For underpinning publications, how far back can we look?
Oh, you put me on the spot. I would say that would be clearing guidance on submissions.
Nice, well done. Okay. Sorry, I'm just trying to pick out things most directly relevant to this section. For smaller unit returns, where the number of case studies is potentially reduced, would it be possible to submit more than the threshold if an HEI felt they had more than the minimum requirement? Likely most relevant for HEIs submitting impact case studies in the single digits. So can you submit more than the minimum?
We considered this, but we thought the complexity of having a variable limit would be another degree of freedom and another moving part, and would not be welcomed by the sector as a further decision to be made. That said, if there's a strong play for it, I personally, I just think the complexity of saying you can submit, 2 or 3 or 4, just makes those decisions much more difficult.
Great, thank you. Comes at it from a different side. The new impact boundaries do not address the disproportionate number of case studies required for small units of assessment. Why not simply use a multiplier like you do for outputs?
So my answer to this question is that at the top end it tails off. Sorry, Morag, were you gonna?
On you go, Harry.
So the issue here is that as the size of your unit increases, you proportionally submit fewer impact case studies, so it tails off. And I think it's just that the value and assessment of those additional outputs doesn't add a great deal to the assessment. We've found from the panels that one more case study at that level doesn't give them a great deal more information on what is going on regarding impact. What we have done is try to lighten the load on smaller units of assessment and smaller institutions by overall reducing the number of case studies, and in particular on the lower end of the scale. That said, yes, it does still tail off at the top end, but I think that's really about panel workload as much as anything else.
Could we have more clarity on the exact timing of HESA data and get a clearer sense of when exactly HEIs will be given the final data? If the data are derived from the 25, 26 and 26, 27 staff data, HEIs may get the final data at the precise time when they have to submit engagement and impact. The deadline used to be in August of the final ref year. Is this going to be adjusted?
I think timetables to be confirmed. Sorry, Maura, go on.
That was essentially what I was going to say. We would make sure that the timetables were well understood, and we will be engaging with HESA on what is practical as well.
Thank you.
Here's a question I don't know that any of us can answer, but it's just to air it.
Great.
Anyone else getting sound feedback issues? I think that there seem to be a few people that have experienced that. I don't know if it's a particular thing. So I don't think any of the panel is. So we kind of apologize, but I don't think that there's much that we're actually going to be able to do if you are experiencing that, and it doesn't seem to be a universal thing, although there are several people that appear to have problems with that. Anyway, that's that. Oh, okay, this one seems popular. I'm going to do this and maybe one or two others quite quickly after, and then move on. I think the earlier question around where the research took place means that if the underpinning research took place at X university, for example, in 2021, then the person moved to another university in 2022 and continued to work on the impact project right up until REF 2028. This would mean the impact would be claimed by the first institution, and the second institution couldn't claim this, which was the case for REF 2021. Sorry, I didn't read that all the way through to the end. It's essentially is making a statement around that.
But
I
it
don't
identifies an
know
area
that
that
we
we'll
can
have to
address it.
clarify.
I beg your pardon, Maury?
Sorry, I'm just saying, but it identifies an area we will have to clarify.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Oh, I like this one. Are there any plans to ask the chairs of the REF 2021 panels to input into the consultation? They would offer valuable perspective, as I think the panels may have many issues with these proposals.
The consultation is open to all to feed into. We obviously will liaise with the panels on a number of things. So yes, you know, we will speak to the panel chairs definitely. But yes, they're free to contribute to the consultation, and I would be as I said, I think the commissioned work on PCE indicators will look to engage with the panels as well, and I think one of the groups that they may wish to speak to is the panel chairs as well.
Great, thank you. Apparently the sound issues are that the sound drops at the start of apparently my sentences. I think maybe we're all luckier as a result of that, perhaps. Okay, and I'm going to ask one more question then, if we can move on, because I'm just mindful of the time. Small HEIs are now trying desperately to increase their volume to over 10 FTE, so the impact statement, which they believe cannot be scored highly for a small UOA, detracts from their overall score and QR funding. Better to submit a further impact case study and have the statement be worth less. This is highly discriminatory and not equality at all. How can it be equal if it has different weightings? So essentially the formula that's used in terms of the number of case studies for HEIs of different sizes.
The number at the lower end has been a matter of a great deal of debate. So insights from the sector on what is currently proposed are going to be looked at with a great deal of interest. Everything will be, but you know that has been a live issue. Hopefully, I realise this is a vain hope, but hopefully people are not already making big organisational changes to address things that have not yet been decided.
Thank you. I mean, we do have a number of other questions, but as I mentioned earlier, I think we move on, and as Duncan suggested, we can maybe try and have a mop up at the end if time allows for some of the outstanding questions. But again, we will work through these. We will address issues through the FAQ as well.
Morag, I think I'm handing over to you now, if that's okay.
So next slide, please. So thanks. So from this point in the seminar, we want to provide you with a bit more information and updates on the issues we haven't addressed yet, but that you will have seen in the consultation. And also on one area that we haven't specifically asked for responses on. So the other issues within the consultation refer to the broader areas of the structure of the research endeavour that we're looking at, mitigation in relation to COVID, and the issue of the Welsh language. Currently, the unit of assessment structure remains the same as in REF 2021, seeking as little disruption as possible. But the consultation asks about what could be changed, what is needed, if anything, and why is that needed. So we would welcome responses on that. There have been a variety of questions within the session today about how operation of units of assessment is going to work as well. So it's clearly an item of some debate. We have recognised that there is a continuing impact from COVID, long COVID, changes in how people have been able to undertake their research in relation to COVID, and indeed the fact that many of us, myself included, are still picking it up once in a while, so that it has not gone away. So we are asking for your perspectives on the proposed measures for mitigation that we have put in place, and whether or not there is anything else we should be taking into account as it has become less of a large-scale national issue that requires national, is requiring big national lockdowns and other such things. So essentially, despite our approach to decoupling and moving away from the individualized focus that we've referred to already, we do want to ensure that there is potential for differential impacts that have been experienced by individuals to be considered, and that's why we're proposing to retain the statements on COVID impact. And there will may potentially be issues about codes of practice as well. And the final set of questions in this relates to legislative requirements within Wales about the need to assess policy impacts on Wales, the impacts of policy developments on the Welsh language. So we need to consider whether or not there are opportunities within this process to increase positive or decrease negative effects on the use of Welsh. And your observations on that would also be welcome. Welsh is not only an issue within Wales, so please remember that when you're thinking about that. Could I have the next slide, please, Duncan? So one of the areas that has been mentioned again in some of the questions already, but has not currently been identified in the consultation on the initial decisions, but is very much an area of development and will be an item for future consultation, is to identify a robust and appropriate open access policy for REF 2028. Now, we recognise that UKRI, one of our larger funders, of course, have an open access policy, and it is our intention that any UKRI open access compliant publication will be considered to meet the REF 2028 open access requirements, and no additional action is required for that. However, and within that, within that decision, I suppose you can also see a reflection of our intention to try and align as much as possible with existing policies. However, we do know that the scope of open access policy for REF 2028 is much broader than the UKRI open access policy. Not everything considered within REF 2028 will have been funded by UKRI. So we need to have a fuller open access policy, and we will be consulting with the sector before we develop that. We commit that we will provide appropriate notice of any new requirements. You won't suddenly be told you have to have done something new 2 years ago. And we also want to be clear that until we announce a new policy, the REF 2021 policy will continue to apply. So that is I know I get that has been a matter of some debate within institutions as well. So REF 2021 in this case continues to be active. There will be a specific consultation on the open access policy for REF 2028 later this year, this actual year, calendar year. And we will be, one of the issues that will be being discussed is whether or not the REF 2028 open access policy should actually align with the UKRI policy. But personally, I suspect it's going to have to be broader than that. Next slide, please, Duncan. So this is the timetable we are operating to. You will all be very well aware that the consultation we're discussing today closes on the 6th of October. But also in October, we are hoping to publish, we're expecting to publish our analysis of the impact case studies that came in REF 2021, just as a final part of the work that was described in the much earlier slide on FRAP, the one with the jigsaw. And the open access consultation that I just referred to. So just to highlight that going forward, there are going to be kind of three decision points. In December, we will be announcing the decisions on the questions that are proposed within this consultation. In April next year, we will be publishing the open access requirements. And in June next year, we will be publishing the draft guidance on submissions, panel criteria, and the culture indicators report. So those are the kind of key milestones as we go along. Throughout this timetable, I hope it's clear that we intend there should be continued engagement and consultation with yourselves and with broader interested parties. So, you know, we do want to continue to hear from you, and we do, if there are difficulties, we do want to try and iron these out before the final guidance on submissions is published. So the next slide, Duncan, please, highlights the links that I'm sure you're all very familiar with, but where you will find the initial decisions document and the consultation survey itself. And I suppose we wish you all the strength you require in assembling your consultation responses to get them into us by 6th of October, and we will move as fast as we can to provide an analysis of those and feed into the publications due later this year. Duncan, at that point, I will hand back to you.
Thanks, Morag. So, excuse me. So that gives us a bit of time for any kind of final questions at the end. I'll leave that slide up. I presume you've already got the links to the documents you need, but I'll leave it up there for now. And invite Miles for any final questions that that have cropped up. We'll do our best to answer as many as we can. And as we've said, we intend to publish a frequently asked questions document shortly after this webinar that will cover any of the ones that we haven't actually addressed, and we will publish that on the JISC website alongside the initial decisions document.
Okay, thank you. Just to lead off, there's a couple of things related to each other, just carrying forward from the last section. I think it's probably worth visiting and see if you have any response to. I mean, so one is saying the ICS accompanying statement should be weighted the same, worth the same for all submissions, regardless of the number of case studies submitted. And a later comment made shortly after is that it's the inequalities the ICS calculations bring wasn't raised. It seems wrong that the inequalities the ICS calculations bring wasn't raised and sorted before being put out for consultation, which seems to go against the equalities agenda and produces an environment in which Russell Group unis can score complete four-star and small HEIs are left with very low scores due to the impact statement weighting. I mean, I thought one of you may want to address the issues being raised of the inequalities the calculations bring not being raised and sorted before being put out for consultation, because I'm not sure that I'd necessarily agree with that characterization.
So one of the questions in the consultation is whether the thresholds are appropriate, and what are the impacts of it introducing reducing the number of case studies required overall. I think actually it's been interesting hearing today that being asked to submit fewer case studies could be seen as a disadvantage. So I think that's definitely something that's worth feeding into the consultation, that a small institution may feel that it's a risk to only have one case study that they're submitting, and that actually sort of having the scope to include further might be a benefit. So I think that's absolutely the sort of thing we'd look to hear from in the consultation.
Great, thank you.
It may well also be worth just saying that the weighting of the impact statement was more an illustration of the impact of what was being proposed rather than intent.
Great, thank you. I think that's actually a really helpful clarifier about what's intended there. Codes of practice. Concerned about the comment that we're hoping that codes of practice won't need to go back to a blank piece of paper. However, given the effects of COVID, changes in staff and closures of some disciplines, changes within universities, the questioner suspects that most HEIs will need to substantially revise their codes of practice. Therefore, will there be a template and a deadline for submission well before the REF submission date? And significant responsibility, is that right, SSR? No, okay. SSR will need improvement before serious REF planning can take place. So will there be a template and a deadline for submission well before the REF submission date for codes of practice?
I think the answer has to be yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think our position is that that the codes of practice, as I've said, codes of practice shouldn't necessarily be starting with a blank sheet of paper. But yes, we recognise that you may there may be revisions required, and maybe you could see this as an opportunity to sort of refine your codes of practice. But yes, there will need to be a deadline for when those revised codes of practice are confirmed, and I presume we'll provide some guidance on that. I think we've been asked to provide sort of examples and templates and guidance on codes of practice. So we will endeavour to do what we can. I normally say things like there's obviously a whole host of codes of practice that are part of the previous exercise that have been published, so you can use those as examples. That said, we recognise that the rules have changed a little bit this time around, so being able to completely apply an existing code of practice isn't necessarily the easiest way.
Great, thank you. the same point has come up from a couple of different questioners or statements anyway, but I think it's very, very relevant here. Professional services staff may not have access to repositories, etc. So outputs published up to now would all be non-compliant. Can those be included? If so, is it lots of OA exceptions, or I guess it begs the question, or some other process? And the related one is to flag that research enabling staff open access checks have not been part of current or regular HEI processes. I think it's a really, really good point that's being made there.
Yeah, absolutely. The tension between wanting to meet the open access requirements whilst also wanting to be inclusive of staff might be one of the things that we need to consider. Yes, good point.
Great, thank you. Okay. Again, is it a question? Is it a statement? I think it's something that you can address regarding COVID impact. The impact of COVID resulted in gender inequalities, and we've got to show greater negative impact on female colleagues. Statements alone will not go far enough to capture this system-wide impact, as they were typically used for exceptional individual circumstances. I think that's probably a point that is one worth for us to capture, and two, it may be something you want to address.
I mean, so our kind of thoughts on individual circumstances are that if we're not attributing outputs to individuals and not requiring minima and maxima for those individuals, that it becomes a simpler process. I think COVID is a different issue, really, in that it should be about where that impacts the unit more than the individual. Morag.
I was just going to say, I think this falls under the question in the consultation. What else should we be considering in relation to COVID?
Great, thank you. A nice easy one. Any chance of restarting a ref contact mailing list against each institution for each, encompassing all the institutions? I think the answer is probably yes, in due course.
Yeah.
The ref team, the UK ref teaming is being built up now with the announcement of the director. So all these administrative elements will be being picked up, I'm sure.
Yes. Point being made here, small HEIs don't have UKRI block grants to fund these requirements. I think this goes back to an earlier section. Which other HEIs can use for systems, resources and staffing? This puts small HEIs at a distinct disadvantage if ref compliance is UKRI policy. I think that relates to open access quite directly. Yes, good point.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'm gonna ask this. I'm gonna be trying to decode it as I'm going through it. I think I'm just trying to read it very quickly. Outputs that were open access but that hadn't had the accepted manuscript uploaded in 3 months weren't able to be included in Ref 2021, even when embargo periods were 24 months. So not getting the accepted manuscript until month 10 made no difference to open access. Can the acceptance part be thought of being removed? It causes a great deal of admin burden. I think that's something that we'll need to review through the open access consultation and development of of the open access policy following.
It's useful to have these comments as we
It is, yeah.
Start drafting it.
Okay. Right. When might REF Secretariat, along with panel member recruitment, start for the criteria setting phase? I had to ask that one.
So in the timetable, we have panel recruitment starting this winter. Duncan, sorry.
Yeah, I imagine Secretariat will align with the panel recruitment. So yeah.
And of course, some of the people on this call may be interested in putting their names forward for some of the Secretariat roles.
Again, this is more of a statement, I think, than a question. But it has a certain amount of support, so I'm going to read it out anyway. The requirement of one case study is very beneficial for small units, and 2 would be a burden on the team. The more I read that, I think the less that I actually understand what it's telling me. Very beneficial for small units, 2 would be a burden. Yeah, okay. No, that's fine. That's in support of the lower.
Yeah, I mean, this has been a part of the on the one hand, on the other hand debate.
Yeah, absolutely.
Quite live around this issue, this level of impact case studies.
Okay. Oh, here's a good one. Will the new or amended codes of practice require approval? I think that the answer is yes.
Yeah.
Anyone want to disagree?
It's worth flagging also that they also require approval with your unions. Well, certainly consultation with your unions and within your organisation, as well as by consultation with the funding bodies. Yeah.
Okay, this question, it slightly revisits something that we've covered earlier, but I think it's actually it's worth revisiting. For small UOAs, there may be disproportionate impact of having, e.g., staff on maternity, parental, or extended leave during the REF cycle. Without individual mitigating circumstances, how can this be addressed in the volume requirements?
Yeah, so I think our position is that the without needing to link staff, there's a reduction in excuse me, there's a reduction in complexity of having to not having to do individual staff circumstances, but there's still an option to have a unit level circumstances. Now, I don't think unit level circumstances should be just adding up the individual level circumstances and returning that as a way of asking for a reduction. But that's not to say you can't argue for a reduction for other reasons. These will be confirmed, the details of this, when we get to guidance on submissions. But I think we absolutely have to be mindful that there are circumstances that will constrain a unit's ability to produce volume of research, and that some of that might well be done on an individual basis. It's just, I think that we want to be careful that we don't just say it's the person, the individual circumstances processed by another name that then adds up to a unit level circumstance. But yes, I think it's a good point that you can be disproportionately affected if you're a very small unit or institution.
Okay, this is a question that's sort of just come in, but I think is actually really quite a good one, quite a valuable one actually. The REF 2021 panels were critical of institutions creating work for themselves and making the process burdensome by reviewing a larger number of outputs than was required for submission based on the volume measure. Institutions obviously did this for reasons of being inclusive and having evidence-based assessments for selection and allocation of the range 1 to 5 papers per individual. Ref 2028 opens up all outputs from any staff member. Surely this creates a huge amount of work for institutions if they wish to be inclusive.
Yes, I understand that. Potentially it does, yes. But I think there's a criticism that institutions were doing this level of pre-assessment anyway. So I think there's kind of an argument that this is a choice that an institution is making to do this. But I do understand, yes, this is perhaps one of the areas that we need to explore further with the sector is the appropriate selection of outputs. It's the sort of thing that may well be covered in your codes of practice. Is how have you been sure that you've been inclusive in selecting outputs? What process have you gone through to make sure that you've been representative? What I would come back to though is that it's not necessarily about representing individuals. That this it's not about individuals being submitted or not submitted to the ref. I think we've tried to design the exercise that it doesn't require a focus on individuals, and I think we're still trying to move away from that. So the idea that it's about individuals is not what we're aiming for. However, I think it's a good point that yes, this might be a more complicated way of doing it in some respects.
Okay, thank you. I'm just trying to think my way through this question. I think it's a good one. I don't know that I'm necessarily understanding it as fully as I might. How do we continue to apply the Ref 2021 policy when exceptions are based on the link between outputs and individuals?
Sorry, I missed that, Miles. What did you say?
How do we continue to apply the Ref 2021 policy when the exceptions are based on outputs and individuals? The link between outputs and individuals.
This for open access, is it?
Yes, it is. I'm trying to. It came up a little bit ago, but it's got a bit of support behind it, so worth addressing.
I think there is very little we can do other than say, I'm afraid you just have to work with it. If it's causing particular problems, please let us have the details, and we will have the open access requirements sorted out by next spring.
Yes, absolutely.
That's what we've got.
And it, yeah, absolutely. And there will be the opportunity to raise these specific issues through the open access consultation, in addition to more specific questions, anything that we need to know about, anything that we need to think about in relation to this. Would you be happy then, Duncan, Morag, others, if we do what we suggested earlier and maybe go for a bit of a mop-up on other questions that were asked earlier? Things are coming in dribs and drabs.
Yeah.
But if we then go to those outstanding from earlier and see if we could address some of those. Okay, nice. Doesn't removing the requirement that impact case studies are underpinned by a 2-star output mean, in effect, that some impact case studies may not be underpinned by research at all?
I think we specifically say they do have to be underpinned by research, don't we?
Okay, thank you.
Please correct me if I'm wrong.
But we are saying, I think, in the consultation about how the panels should judge that they still have rigor and are done in a rigorous way. So it doesn't have to be 2-star research, but it does have to be produced in a rigorous way.
Okay, thank you. Allocating staff to UOAs in HESA rather than rather than through a direct ref submission is still a ref staff submission. The actual mechanism makes little difference internally. HESA just adds more complexity, burden, and cost. Anybody want to address that one?
Yeah, I mean, okay, there is additional data that you're returning to HESA in terms of the unit of assessment. However, I think what you're arguing here is that there's extra burden and cost in ensuring that your HESA return is rigorous and correct, and that is the fault of the ref. And I think that our position is that your HESA data should be rigorous and correct outside of the ref anyway. So that's where we stand on it. But yeah, okay, there is an increased burden, I guess, in saying you have to allocate your staff members to a unit of assessment.
Although for many staff, there will be a unit of assessment sorted out anyway in terms of postgraduate supervision, I believe.
Yeah, I mean, also, I suppose from the point of view of collecting data at a number of points in the cycle, it's not about sort of returning your data 2 or 3 times. It's about ensuring that it remains up to date, which it isn't about starting from scratch. The startup cost should be substantially less on that because your data should be more or less there, and it's about sort of making slight changes to it from one year to the next.
Okay, I don't know that we've got a huge amount of time left. We've got 4 minutes. Maybe we can take one more question. There are a couple of meaty ones here. Enough of that?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm just going to read this one verbatim, as I have done many of the others, actually. The most difficult and burdensome part of staff lists is in determining the independence status of research specialist staff. This has not changed. Yet, rather than doing this once for a single census date, we must now do it multiple times. Actually, given the question mark, I think that should be read as, must we now do it multiple times? Or maybe it's just incredulous at the prospect. The process mandated by EDAP requiring us to individually evaluate the independence of thousands of staff and communicate the outputs to them and implement an appeals process should not be underestimated. Sorry, that's again, it's more statementy, but again, you might want to respond.
I think Duncan's point in the previous question also holds good. For the majority of staff, this will be just confirming a decision that was made before. It would, I suppose we would envisage it as happening as part of the normal annual review process that most employers undertake. So that any change would be a matter of discussion and hopefully not requiring appeal processes. I realise that's a bit disingenuous.
I'm not sure I'd say it like that. Right, I'm just going to say it's about 2 minutes to the end of the webinar, and it would probably be best to call an end to the questions now and give Duncan a chance to wrap up, make any closing statements, please, etc. So if we do that.
Great, yeah, thanks, Miles. Yeah, so first of all, yeah, thank you for attending and thank you for your insightful questions. As ever, there's a few things that we anticipated, but quite a lot of food for thought for us as well on things that we hadn't thought through. So, particular things about the sort of thresholds for the impact case studies and some of the kind of details that need sort of thinking through on guidance on codes of practice and the complexities of these sort of areas. I would say that all of this is largely we've identified some areas that are important to feed into the consultation itself. So I think some of the things we've been discussing now are really good to have it highlighted. But I would say don't let that stop you from also including that in your return to the survey that we have. And then I would also reiterate that, as we've said, we plan to publish the slides in the webinar alongside some FAQs on our website that's hosted by JISC as soon as we're able to, just to kind of close off all of the questions that were asked. So we will look through any of the open questions that we have not yet answered. As I said, I thought it was always ambitious that we wouldn't be able to get through everything in the time we have today. So we'll pick out anything that really stands out as not being answered, and we'll try to weave that into our frequently asked question pool. What we won't have is a kind of list of every single question answered individually. We'll try and keep this to a sensible document that can be read through and worked with. So with all of that said, I just want to thank my funding body colleagues for being online for the presentations and for helping out with the questions, and thanks to Miles and Olivier for kind of managing questions in the background as well. Yeah, thank you all for listening, and we'll leave it at that.